Hey folks, this is Mark with Eigen Designs, and today in the shop, we're going to be taking this rough lumber and turning it into a basket weave cutting board. In this video, I'll cover the steps to create the components that will make the board, along with any relevant dimensions. I'll also be getting a special visit from the shop superintendent, who's going to help me with some of the final measurement and assembly of the board. We'll also be adding a juice groove to this cutting board using the CNC, so this is definitely one you don't want to miss. For today's build, we're going to be using a combination of mahogany, maple, cherry, and walnut, but you can tweak the species of wood that you use to create the pattern colors that you're looking for. Let me start today by going over the design in detail. So the design will call for a series of alternating strips between walnut and a pattern that I'm calling basket. Each are going to be 1 3/4 by 1 3/4. The walnut's pretty self-explanatory, but the basket is going to be a combination of cherry, mahogany that you see here, and also maple. The cherry is going to be 3/4 of an inch thick. The mahogany strips are going to be 1/4 of an inch thick. And the maple will eventually be 1/4 of an inch thick, but I'm going to leave it a little bit bigger so that I can plane it down to the exact thickness in a later step. So let's head over to the jointer and get started. With each of the boards jointed and planed, I head over to my bandsaw to do some resawing on the cherry, maple, and the mahogany. I'll resaw these a little bit thicker than what I need and then use the planer to get the final thickness tuned just right and have a smooth surface in preparation for glue up. And if you're uncomfortable putting really thin stock through your planer, you can also use a drum sander and achieve the same result. Now you'll notice I'm using wider panels to create these basket strips, and that's because I can get 4 strips out of a larger panel rather than doing each of them individually. However, if you don't have the resawing capability to do anything that big, you can do these individually. It'll just take a little bit longer. Next up, it's time to do the first of 3 different glue ups for this particular cutting board design. I apply a generous layer of Titebond 3 between each of the panels and then crank that using a total of 16 parallel clamps. I'm trying to get consistent pressure throughout the panel to ensure that there's no gaps in between the different pieces. While that's drying, it's time to turn our attention to the 8 walnut boards that need to be cut for this design. I'll be using the Jessam stock guides to keep consistent firm pressure against the table saw fence throughout the cut, and I'll be cutting these a shade wider than 1 3/4 because all final thicknessing will be done through the planer to ensure consistency with the other boards. With the walnut boards cut, we can now go back to the basket boards that are going to be cut from the panels that we glued up earlier. Since the table saw is already set up to the right dimensions, we can just get after it. Okay, I thought it would be helpful to pause here and just do a quick check on the thicknesses of the material. If you remember, we were leaving the maple a little bit thicker so we had additional material to plane down as we were trying to get the board to exactly 1.75 inches. As you can see, we're at about 1.9 right now, and we need to get down to 1.75. So we have a little bit of material to remove from the maple, and once we're done with this process, the maple should be 1/4 of an inch on both sides. With the basket boards now at final dimension, it's time to do the same thing to the walnut. We can now begin arranging the boards in preparation of the upcoming glue up. On the right hand side, it's going to be an alternating pattern between walnut and horizontal stripes. And on the left hand side, the pattern is going to be walnut and vertical stripes. These two panels are going to be glued up separately, and then when combined together in a later step, it is going to create the basket pattern effect. It's now time to glue up the two panels that we've just arranged. And because each of these boards are already at final dimension, you'll want to make sure that as you're applying pressure with the parallel clamps, you're not causing any misalignment on the top of the boards. Everything should be completely flush with one another. You can then clean up the excess glue with a wet rag because you don't have much tolerance to send these through the planer or drum sander again without jeopardizing the pattern. I let both panels sit in the clamps overnight and returned the next day with the shop superintendent who wanted to oversee my work as we made the final cuts for these boards. With the final cut complete, I create the basket weave pattern by taking boards from alternating piles and putting them together. There's enough strips here to make 3 different cutting boards that are about 21 inches by 14 inches. Andy then supervised me while I put together the remaining 2 boards, and he was kind enough to let me borrow his measuring tape to make sure that the boards are the right dimensions. And it's a good thing that we were doing that because whenever I checked this board, turns out we were 1 short.
Oh, it's not because we're missing one. We are missing one of these. Ah, that's why we always measure to double check. Okay, so we've got 21 inches by 14.
Except before I even did it.
It's now time for the third and final glue up, and Andy decided to help me with the roller, so I grabbed the brush to get all the edges and quickly realized that I had put a little bit too much glue on. So I ended up taking some of the excess glue off, but once that was done, it was time for the alignment. And this part's really important for the pattern to come out perfectly. A little bit of table salt can be helpful in this process, but also be slow to apply the clamping pressure so the boards don't slide past you as you apply more and more pressure. Once the boards have a chance to dry, I flatten each of them with the drum sander using 60 grit sandpaper. I prefer using the drum sander over the CNC or even a router with a slab flattening jig because I find that it's quicker. But one of the downsides of using a drum sander is it leaves behind straight lines or gouges in your work. So you then have to come behind it with a random orbital sander and help clean up all those lines. And I usually use 80 grit to get the job done. Now, juice grooves are completely optional on a cutting board. It really comes down to personal preference and application of the cutting board. I personally like them, so I'll be doing one today. And I've done these by hand before, but because I have a CNC, I'm going to use it. With the juice grooves cut, there's only a few final steps to put some finishing touches on these boards and they'll be done and dusted. I head over to my router table and put a chamfered edge on all sides of the cutting board. And then I use this flute bit to put nice but subtle handles on each of these cutting boards. I've really come to enjoy this for cutting board handles, so I'll put a link to this in the description below if you want to check it out. The last step before we apply finish is just to go through all the sanding grits. I normally start off with 80 and then jump to 120, 180, and 220. I know sanding's boring to watch, so I'll go ahead and skip through this part. The last step in this process is to apply a mineral oil finish. And while that's happening, I'm going to ask that you give this video a like if you got something of value, and consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. I'm going to close this video early and leave you with some B-roll footage of the finished board, and I'm going to play you some more of that AI-generated intro music that you heard at the beginning of this video. So stay safe in the shop, and I'll see you on the next one.
Welcome to Maket Designs. Welcome to Maket Designs. Like inside for the algorithm. Making designs, no clickbait, just first tool. Why can't we see his face? Welcome to Maket Designs. Welcome to Maket Designs. Making Designs.